Hello. Okay, it's working. Hello. All right. So, hey Jesse, hey Michael, hey Riley. Good to see all of you in the chat. If you haven't seen the Google Drive link up above the comments in the top of the comments, I have some scores to follow along with, and a sheet that basically has a bunch of analysis. So please feel free to check that out. Oh, hey Chris, great to see you as well. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. All right, so what I want to do is, well, first of all, hope everyone's doing well with all this COVID-19 business happening. Staying healthy and everything. And hopefully you're finding some time to practice. And sound a little bit robot-like. Does that sound better? Oh, hey Felix, good to see you. Let me know if that sounds any better. Yes. So, okay. That's what's going on. Okay. How is that? Is that better? Let me know if that's better. And then I'm also going to test a couple other things. I'm using this software called OBS, Open Broadcast Studio. So I'm still figuring this out. So let me know if you can see my screen. I have these two settings here. One is me, one is the screen. Can you see that? Oh, good. That sounds good. Great. Okay. Thanks, guys. All right. So, yes, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay. So, hope you're all doing well. Love to hear what you're all up to. But for now, I'd like to get into this arrangement. So, I'm going to let you, for just a second, go to the Google Drive folder that's up above, so you can grab some scores to follow along with. And I'm going to actually play the audio over my speakers, so it'll just be coming through the microphone. So if you want to mute this audio and use your own window to play the YouTube video for better quality, you can. But I'm going to follow along with the score, and so I'll have it up here for you to follow along with. So I have 3 files in there. There's the full score, which has all 6 woodwind parts, and then I have the piano reduction, which I just finished working on today, which has all of the voicings and all of the basically all crunched up into a piano reduction score. So we're going to talk about that. And then the third page I have is just a sheet with a bunch of analysis of how I think about this stuff. And this is probably, I don't know, I feel kind of dorky writing all this stuff out, but anyways, so it's here. You can take it, use it for free, whatever you want to do with it. It's all yours. So, all right, so here we go. I'm going to just hit play, and then we're going to follow along with the piano reduction. All right, sweet. Um, so we're done listening to that. So if you have any input, comments, questions, anything extra to add along the way, just throw it in the comments, and I'll try to watch for that. But yeah, so this was a super fun arrangement for me to do because, first of all, I love this tune. I think it's a really fun one. It's also something that I like to do, is just to write music that works on stuff that's really hard. So I heard that Dick Oates would say this a lot, where if you're really bad at playing over rhythm changes, write a rhythm changes to play over. If you're really bad at, giant steps, write a giant steps contrafact. So that's kind of the idea here. Is I'm writing this music as an expression of, I like the song, but I also wanted to challenge myself as a player too. So these parts aren't easy, and they took quite a while to record because they are really, really hard and a lot of overdubbing. But let's go to the analysis sheet first. So I'm going to pan my way over to the share screen. Here we go. So so in this sheet I have a few categories: form, harmony, line writing, harmonization, orchestration, and that's it. So let's just go over a few things, starting with form. So as you're following along, if you ever want to go back and listen to this with the form in front of you, you might be able to follow along a little bit. Thanks, Doshi. If you listen close enough, you'll hear plenty of mistakes. Okay, so number one, intro, which is already built into the tune. There's that 16-bar bass line. Just a G7 chord, and so that's already in there. And then the head, Jim Kellerman, thanks for not saying you did first takes on everything. Believe me, I didn't do first takes for anything. Okay, so then the head the first time is 16 bars, and then it goes back to the interlude, which is just the intro again, 16 bars of G7. The second time the head is reharmonized, and I'll share that technique I used for that chorus down below in the harmony section. Then I had two choruses of woodwind soli. Those choruses include the little 16 bars of G7 chord in the bass line, and then I have basically a chorus and a half of alto sax solo. Finally, as just a way to change up the pace, I added a little counterpoint section. It's basically in essence 2-point counterpoint, except that the bottom line is broken up in the low instruments to kind of have a dovetailing effect, and then the top line isn't just a line, it's a harmonized 3-part harmony. So and it mostly follows the chords of the original tune. And then the outro is the bass line with shifting harmony. It goes up a half step every so often. And I tried to make it somewhat surprising and random where it shifts, because I think that's kind of a cool effect. But there's also this hemiola 3/2. So it's just a bunch of dotted quarters. Also in the form, my composition mentor from Eau Claire, when I was going to college there, Ethan Wickman, I was taking classical composition lessons from him, which is cool because it gives you a really different perspective. But he showed me this idea of the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden ratio, which is kind of this like ratio that you find all over the place in nature. But it's very common in musical pieces for the climax of a piece to occur at somewhere around the golden ratio. And I actually did the math on this based on how many seconds into the piece the climax is. It's like the alto solo with the little flute riff on top. The golden ratio occurs at 61.8%. I'm a little off because my climax was 70% of the way through, but I think, it's close enough to be approximately where the golden ratio occurs. It's more of a general guideline, but I think that tends to be something I at least think about subconsciously. So harmony, I think, is one of the biggest things that I focus on with this arrangement. So I'm going to go through some of the voicings using the piano reduction score. I have to attribute a lot of these concepts to Rich DeRosa, the arranging professor at North Texas, because I studied with him for 5 years total. And I learned a lot of good techniques from him. And then just transcribing stuff too, transcribing piano parts, or just listening to music with complex harmony has been really influential too. But I have these 7 considerations that I kind of think about with every voicing. A lot of times I don't necessarily think about them in this 7-step process, but when I kind of look back on them, this is kind of the things I consider. So first of all, voice leading from chord to chord, note to note is always a consideration when you're voicing out horizontal or vertical harmonies that end up being horizontal lines in the instruments. Secondly, which chord tones are present. So that's, a really important thing when you're voicing out a chord is determining which chord tones to leave out and put in. Is it a voicing of the presented chord? So in other words, if it's E flat major 7, sometimes you can have a chord voicing that floats on top, but as a passing chord, but it isn't the actual chord. So that's something you considered. Is it an outside voicing that needs to be resolved? That's especially true in like soli writing. How are the notes arranged from top to bottom, thirds and sevenths versus extended harmony? So one thing that I really learned at North Texas with Rich DeRosa was that when you're voicing out jazz harmony, thirds and sevenths are typically found at the bottom of the voicing. And he would always make a point to say that even with the most creative jazz arrangers like Gil Evans and Bob Brookmeyer and Ellington and Strayhorn and all these really, kind of innovative arrangers, you're still going to find these thirds and sevenths typically towards the bottom of a voicing, and then the extended harmony tends to be towards the top. And then now and then you can break these rules, and that's fine. It's just that you need to break them very carefully with intention. And I do that quite a bit in this arrangement. I'll try to point some of those out. But in general, thirds and sevenths go towards the bottom. And it's kind of like a pyramid, or any kind of a skyscraper or tall structure. You have to put the foundational stuff at the bottom. If you put the wide part of the pyramid at the top, it would fall over. So that's why we need these lower harmonies towards the bottom. Okay, so what are the cross relationships inside the voicing? This is something I got to give out a shout out to Brian Nichols, the great piano player in Minneapolis that I grew up listening to and took some lessons from. And I remember he was doing a master class on voicings, and he was talking about you analyze not only the, like linear notes, so if I have this G minor 9 voicing, I'm not just going, okay, D to B flat is a major third, B flat to A is a minor second, A to F is a major third. I'm not just thinking about those direct connections, but I'm also going across and going D to B flat is a major third, D to A is a perfect fourth, D to F is a major sixth. So within this voicing, I have major thirds, I have a major sixth, I have a fourth, I have a half step, and I have 2 fourths. So this is like the DNA of a chord structure. It has all of these intervals present within it, and that basically plays into the emotional quality in the sound that you're trying to go for. So that's what I mean by cross relationships within the voicing. Number 6, mostly trying to avoid doubled pitches. But if necessary, if you want to double a note, why are you doing it, and which pitch do you double? So that was another thing that Brian Nichols, in his voicings masterclass, brought up, was that usually in piano voicings, you want to try not to repeat pitches, except when it's really intentional or when it's really the right thing to do. So, and then similarly, at North Texas, Rich DeRosa was teaching me about how if you're going to double a pitch, double the melody. So you could double the melody up or in the same register or down an octave or up an octave. So, or if there's any pitch that's a particularly juicy note that you want to bring out, you could double that pitch. So it just depends, but you just have to be careful with what you're doing there. And then seventh, how do the notes lay out on each instrument when voiced into parts? So this is more of an orchestration example. Okay, let me quickly address these questions. Toshi, do you know of any examples of fundamental harmony being written in the upper structure of a chord while the extensions are below? Just curious. Michael, anything? Claire Fisher. Let's see. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, so sorry I can't give you a specific example, but that's probably because there isn't a ton of examples of it. So I don't know. You'd probably have to find them in a score. But yeah, if you find some examples, let me know. Thanks for the question. Okay, so the harmonization style here is basically 5-note independent voicing technique, which let's see, I'll point out some voicings here. So let's just get into the weeds with these voicings. All right, so right there at the beginning, we see that we have G 13 sharp 11 and F sharp 13 sharp 11. We're going to start with G 13, and I'll tell you why in a sec. So there's my voicing. So those are 5 separate pitches, and that's what I mean by 5-note independent voicings. Because in the big band tradition, a sax soli would typically have the bari and the alto playing the same note an octave apart. And so that would be what we call traditional shell voicings or traditional block voicings. But what I did is I have 5 different pitches so that everyone's on their own unique pitch. That gives it a more modern sound. It allows you to use more color tones, which are ninths, 11ths, sharp 5s, flat 5s, flat 9s, sharp 9s, all that kind of stuff. And the F sharp 13 sharp 11 is just the chromatic chord that leads into G 13 sharp 11. So this is what we call chromatic plaining, because it's the exact same voicing, just pitched up a half step. And that's because the bass line does that. It goes right? So I'm basically reflecting that half step motion in the chord voicing. And I like this close together harmony. So it's this is the G 13 sharp 11, because in this voicing we have major 7th on the outside of the voicing, which gives it this spiky edge to it. But then we also have a perfect 5th between the E and the A. We have tritone. We have flatted 6th or raised 5th, depending on how you think of it. We have some 4ths. So we have a nice kind of mixture of intervals. And then we have 3 whole steps in a row in the middle. So it's a nice little cluster. And when you have these clusters close together like that, it has some nice overtone interaction that happens up above that kind of creates some magic. So yeah, there we go. So let's check out these other voicings. D 13 sharp 11 flat 9. I chose that because it leads by half step into the E flat major 7 or E flat 6/9 in this case, which is basically just a choice that I made. So a D13 flat 9. Let's see. Has this nice sound. A 13 chord with a flatted 9 has this cool sound because you can create a triad on the top of it. So you could do, if it was spelled differently, you could think of it as a B major triad on top of a D7 voicing. So a D7 in the lower parts, and then a B major triad in the top. So that's got a cool sound to it. And in contrast to these close together voicings, this voicing has more of a fourth spaced approach. So by that I mean it's got spread out voicings over more of a roughly fourths between the notes. That top one is a major third. But otherwise, it's mostly fourths. So, okay, and then same with this next voicing, the E flat with the 6/9. That's all fourths, except for the top is a major third. So if you have a bunch of fourths and then you add in a major third, that can be a really cool sound. It sounds much more modern, very McCoy-Tyner. And it also ends up emphasizing chord tones like the 6, 9, and then sometimes others, but in this case the 6 and the 9, which is why I labeled it 6/9 instead of major 7. And then you can see as the range gets lower, the chords get closer together. So it goes from this to this. Let's see. Sorry. So they get slightly more crunched as they get lower. This is because another thing I learned at North Texas was this concept that if you get too low into the bass register, you start to interfere with the nature of the chord. So like if you have a really low D, let's say we're doing a D7 chord, you know, if the 3rd and the 7th are too low, that sounds like nothing. It just sounds way too muddy. So if you put that up an octave, the 3rd and the 7th up an octave, it makes much more sense because it's not interfering with that low muddy range. So the lower I get, the more close together I put them so that I avoid these big sprawling voicings that get really low below the melody note. So you'll see that the higher I get, the more I spread these out. And that's another Rich DeRosa concept. All right, so and this is roughly the concept for this melody here. You can see that I really like to use 13 sharp 11th chords a lot. I really like to use sharp 9 sharp 5 chords, which sound like this. So that's a big sound in my repertoire that I like to use quite a bit. Okay, so let's go down to, let's go down to the second chorus where it has the reharmonization. I suspect a lot of you have done lots of reharmonizations. Let's see. Oh, as you're going along, can you talk to how you're adjusting the voicings? Keep in mind the flute and clarinet are on top. Okay, sure. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so throughout this arrangement, I kept it pretty simple. It's the order from top to bottom of the distribution of notes is flute, clarinet, soprano, alto, tenor, and then the bass clarinet really functions as an upright bass player. It just plays separate bass notes. So the voicing is really mostly 5-part voicings, so yeah, how do I adjust the voicings to keep in mind the flute and clarinet are on top? I try to keep the flute in the range that's going to speak. So you're not going to find a lot of really, really low stuff in here because as a flute player, I can even demonstrate for a second here. So like if you get to the high register, those notes are real bright. They speak really well. They resonate, they ring, and they project. You go below, I don't know, B in the staff, and those notes start to become much more quiet. Whereas on the sax, the lower you go, the louder it gets. So trying to keep all the instruments in their optimal ranges is a good idea. So like I try to keep the saxes from getting too low so they don't overpower the flute and the clarinet. At the same time, I try to keep the flute and the clarinet in their mid to upper registers to make sure that they always have like a flattering sound to them. But I find that generally speaking, flute and clarinet will blend pretty well no matter what. They just have very compatible sounds. Like one of the things that I studied in undergrad in the orchestration class was classical orchestration. And there's 2 types of voicings they pointed out. One was, I can't remember what they called it, but basically if you have 3 flutes and 3 clarinets, you voice the notes so that the flutes are in a voicing together and the clarinets are in a separate range voiced together. Then you have interlocking harmonies, which is where you alternate flute, clarinet, flute, clarinet, flute, clarinet. And you can do that with any grouping of 2 instruments. So in this case, I always keep it flute, clarinet, and it blends really well. And so that's how I manage it. Also, because I'm doing this digitally, I have much greater control of the mix, so I don't have to worry about it as much. But I think also because there's no rhythm section, I don't have to worry about, drums covering up the flute or whatever. So as long as the players can balance themselves, it should work itself out if it's written well enough. Okay, good question, Michael. I hope that answers that for you. Toshi, do you think the sharp 5, sharp 9, and the 13, sharp 11, as they are tritone subs of each other? Yes. So, let's see. So what Toshi's saying is that if this is a F sharp 7, sharp 9, sharp 5, and you just moved the F sharp bass note to a C, the tritone away, it now becomes a C13. So sharp 11 if you add the F sharp in there. So yes, definitely that upper structure is very flexible between those 2, and I think that's one of the reasons I like it. It's got a little bit of versatility and ambiguity, so it's very flexible. And then Toshi, were there times in your arrangement where you wrote lower flute parts, but due to it being recorded, you could boost it in the mix above more prominent sax parts? Not really. I pretty much set the mix and forgot it. There's not a whole lot of there's really not much automation that I did, because it tended to blend itself. Once I had the overall level set, it was pretty good. Michael, yes, as I was not as aware of keeping saxes higher to temper them. Makes sense acoustically. Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing is, if the saxes get too high, then they start getting bright again. So you want to keep them in sort of that optimal register, like, I don't know what you would say, maybe like low G to B above the staff or something. That's a pretty tame range, and then you start getting above or below that, and you start getting bright, loud notes. A good player can make it all sound good, but to within reason. But as an arranger, we want to keep in mind what's going to be an annoyance for the players, and we want to try to keep them happy. We want to try to keep them playing stuff that makes them confident and feel good about what they're playing. And at the same time, challenge them too, right? In the right ways. The middle octave, exactly. Yep. And then with anything orchestration, once you hear it live, you'll start to notice those things. So I would say the more you can just write something and try it out with a group of players, the better you'll understand how this stuff works, because a lot of it ends up becoming instinctual rather than incredibly scholarly. So, at first you think about it like kind of more academically, and then it becomes more visceral, like you start to feel a note where it's going to lay on an instrument. Yes, thank you for the questions, you guys. This is awesome. All right, so as I was going through this and labeling my voicings, I realized there's a lot of silliness in these voicings, and by that I mean there are some that I could kind of label in a more clear way, and some of them that I think I was just feeling the chord and feeling the voicing and writing it down, not so much thinking about exactly what to call it. I think that's a good way to write, because you're still aware of the theory behind it, but I found myself going back and thinking like, I really don't know what I was thinking of this as, except that it works between voice leading between these chords. So okay, so for this reharmonized chorus, let me just play a little bit of this so you can hear it, and then I'll go over how I constructed it. Okay, so let's see, back to the score. Okay, so if you look at the bass line here, I called it forcing chromatic bass motion. It's so basically, I'm just literally starting with not quite a random note, but I'm starting with a note or a chord that's not the original chord, and then I'm just moving it up by half steps. So then I'm forcing myself to come up with chords on top that fit with that bass note. So this is another, I can probably attribute almost all of my jazz arranging to Rich DeRosa's lessons. But anyways, I remember bringing in reharmonizations of tunes, and he would suggest different things. And one of the things he would suggest was, let's say the first chord is an E flat major 7, which is the case for this tune. And the melody note's a D. Instead of starting on an E flat major 7, he was like, what if you started it on E minor 7 so that you still have that D in the top, but it's almost the same bass note, but it's just off enough to give it a fresh sound. And then from there, keep moving it up. So this is basically the key to reharmonization, using those DeRosa slash chords. Yep. Basically, like, this is such a fresh way to do it because you end up with all these chords that would never necessarily occur to you otherwise. So like, so if I know that the top note is B flat and the bottom note is F, that limits me to a certain degree. But F minor 11 is a nice sound with that fourth chord tone in the top. So, you know, you could think of other things, like if you wanted to be more dissonant, you could do like a polychord, like or a slash chord, G flat major over F, you know, for a little more dissonance, or I don't know. You could find a bunch of other cool stuff. But I'm gonna stick with what I came up with, which is F minor 11. And what's cool about this too is that the if the melody's moving down and the bass line's moving up, then you have contrary motion. And in all of these aspects of the piece, you want to try to create a good variety of the different types of contrapuntal motion, parallel, contrary, oblique, and similar. So yeah, so this is one of the chords I love, is when you have like a 13th chord sus4. You could also think of this as just E major 9 over F sharp. I love that sound. It's super Herbie Hancock. And then, so you can see I have a lot of sus chords and 11th chords, and threw in a B flat major 7 sharp 11 for good measure. And then Jesse Myers wrote, I know the focus is the harmony, but the half note rhythm is a wonderful contrast from the previous chorus. Thank you. Yes, that was the other thing, is that it was, yeah, like wanting to change up the rhythmic feel. I wanted it to have this sense of rising tension and build up, so that, you know, there's a little bit of a rhythmic counterpoint where the melody does its own thing, and then at times it lines up with the bass line, at times it doesn't. This actually was inspired a little bit by the Dirty Loops cover of, what's that song? Wake me up when it's all over. I can't remember the name of that song, but it's their cover of that song. And there's this one section where they do that. I think it's the chorus, where they just have this like rising harmony that moves underneath it. And it's just really cool. So I kind of had that floating through my mind underneath this melody. All right. So yeah, so I basically forced my way into those chord voicings. And then I wanted to also highlight the use of diatonic plaining here, which just means, you know, within a key center, within a scale, you just take a chord shape and you just move all the notes up in the scale. So in this case, I really like this kind of this thing where there's like clusters of seconds separated by thirds. And then, so that's all basically just planing through the scale. And then here, I like when the top note, where it kind of breaks into an accent, it breaks into a bigger, more dissonant harmony. So you can see that it opens up from this closed position voicing to an open position voicing, and that highlights the top chord. This is something that I watched a Netflix special on architecture on this like famous architect. Can't remember who it was, but there is this one building that had this huge atrium, but the entryway was this tiny little thing, right? So basically, like, let's say this is the entryway, and then here's the atrium. You're walking through the entryway door, and it's this small hallway, little entry area, and because it's so small, it actually amplifies your sense of largeness at the big open atrium. So I always think back to that, and I think this is what a useful concept with arranging. If you can have a bunch of clustered up notes and then open it up into this big voicing, the fact that it's coming from a small voicing makes the big voicing feel much bigger. So that's what I had going on there. And you'll also see as I get higher up, the voicings open up more. So I could spend a lot of time on voicings. I'll try not to get too caught up on it because you all have this to look at if you'd like. But here's an example. This is the soli now. Here's an example of a voicing where I actually put one of the upper structure notes at the bottom. Since you were asking for examples, I actually pointed it out because it was one of those rare moments. So it's an A13. Let's see if I can read that many ledger lines. Yeah, there we go. So normally you might have wait a second. Did I do that right? There we go. Yeah, so normally this sharp 11 would be in the middle or top of the voicing, like that, with the thirds and the sevenths kind of setting it up. But in this case, I actually really liked using the sharp 11 at the bottom because it sets up sort of a tritone sub sound. So that was one example where I did use it. So in this soli, there's all these moving lines, right? So if you just played, first of all, the first thing I always come up with for a soli is the leading line. So let's see, gotta adjust my range on my digital keyboard. Let's see, scroll down. So I didn't practice playing these lines on piano, but you can kind of see that top line is always the melody line. And then what I do is I go through and I harmonize them. So one thing that was kind of interesting as I was going through again and just labeling everything today was sometimes when you go through and analyze your own music to do some kind of teaching with it, you end up seeing things that you didn't really notice, patterns and stuff. But I noticed that I really I tend to gravitate towards using half-step shifts. So right here, that first voicing is a G13 sharp 11. And then I went to the half step above, A flat 13 sharp 11. And it's just a different inversion of the voicing so that it closes up. But I really love this sort of like using a half step as a way to create a tension chord. You know, it's like a tritone sub of the dominant. So it's you always want to have some kind of motion within your voicings so that it doesn't just get stagnant, because otherwise you could go, that doesn't sound quite as musical as to me as to have that constant motion happening. Let's see. Michael Clement, in the Soli, did you write the bass line first? Quite a few interestingly placed roots. No, I wrote the bass line last, if I remember correctly, and I treated it basically like just an improvised bass line. So I just came up with a bass line that if I were, coming up with a bass line underneath a band, that's what I would come up with. So it ends up being quite random compared to the lines, because I really wanted it to feel like an organic bass line. Yeah, good question. So yeah, and one of the things that I love, because I transcribe charts sometimes, and I always end up with these questions of what's the bass note, what's the chord, and sometimes you get a bass note that's kind of a weird placement along with the upper structure chord, and it's because it's just an improvised bass line. So it's sometimes that randomness can come up with some accidental coolness that I think is part of what makes jazz so awesome. But yeah, so once you start to get into these moving lines, you start to see that on almost every chord I'm changing to a new chord quality. So and this is what, like earlier when I said there's a lot of silliness in these voicings, this is kind of what I meant. Like you see D major 6/9. Let's see if I can play some of these. So, and then it goes to F7 sharp 9, and then to a G major 9. So there's not necessarily a super like classically sound logic behind some of these chord voicings, and that's intentional. That's part of what makes jazz fun, is that you can have so much freedom with the way you do your chords. I also have these little arrows pointing to chords that have sounds derived from the diminished scale. So by that I mean, if you put all these notes together, you get notes from the half whole diminished scale. And so basically that F sharp 7 sharp 9 is just a little hint of the diminished scale. You could add other notes within that, to give it more tension. Then here, G sharp 7 sharp 9, C sharp 7 sharp 9. So they're just kind of colorful passing chords. And again, I think when I was writing these, I would just kind of come up with stuff that I thought felt good leading from one to the next. It was only today that I actually sat down and came up with names for them, and a lot of times I was like, that's really weird that I came up with these particular voicings. Like, honestly, like, it shouldn't work. It shouldn't work if you just look at it and you're like, what? Yeah, I would never think of that. So it's just one of those things where your ear kind of guides you towards voicings that sound cool. Yeah. All right. So here, I had quite a big jump in the melody. So what I did was I took a closed position voicing, and then I opened it up to a drop 2, which I'll explain in a sec if you're not familiar. So what a drop, actually this is a drop 2 and 3. So basically, if this were a closed position voicing, it would be like that. F, E flat, C, A, F sharp. Instead, what I have is I dropped the second note from the top, so that would be a drop 2 down an octave. So that E flat is now an octave lower. So now I have more space between the melody and the voicing. And then drop 2 and 3, I'm going to drop the second from the top and the third from the top. So that's voicing is a drop 2 and 3. I should have labeled it that way, but yeah. And then you can see that the next time I put it back into closed position, once I gave the instruments a chance to reset, because they didn't have to jump from this lower voicing. Mackenzie Music Productions, Daryl Mackenzie, good to see you. More about the melodic line of the inner parts and the chords that happen to land anywhere. So one thing that I noted in the sheet here is that I was thinking of these as one chord at a time voicings, and so you end up with pretty cool sounding voicings, but a lot of times the unintentional consequence to this is that the parts are really hard to play because you're not thinking melodically, you're thinking vertically in terms of chords. When Drew Zaremba and myself interviewed David Berger, the master arranger, composer, band leader for the Arrangers podcast, one of the things that stuck out to me was that he said, as great as Thad Jones' music is, one of its weaknesses is that it's hard to perform because everything is a vertical harmony. So I would say I was definitely thinking more like a Thad Jones type of approach to this piece, and I had to kind of deal with my own choices because I had to record all the parts. And when you're playing clarinet and everything is over the break register and it's super, super awkward, uncomfortable stuff, it's not fun. So, let's just take a look at the score, and we can see some of these inner parts. In fact, I can even play some for you. Let's find a good spot here. Thanks for the question, Daryl. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, this seems like a good place. All right. So I got my clarinet. All right, so here we go. I'll play from measure 111. Okay. Exactly. The mistakes I'm making tell you the story there. It's not an easy part. I'll go to another part here. I had to mark in L. That's on clarinet. There's left fingerings and right fingerings for some of the notes, and I had to make sure that I played the right fingering, so I had to label these L, R, and L here. So those are really pretty thorny parts. And this whole register from basically B flat to D flat is called the break register in the clarinet. And you have these two alternating pinky notes for each note. And so you have to make these choices. So this whole register is really thorny, and voila, I happen to write a lot of notes in that register. So, there's more. Let's try that line. So not exactly the most melodic of lines, right? So there's always this balance between how much you want to, I guess, expect your players to adjust to the difficulty of the lines, and then how much of it you want to help them by making the lines extremely playable. And I think someone like Thad Jones, he always had the best players, so he could just write these crazy harmonies. So when I'm writing something like this, you know, I'm assuming that this is going to be played by musicians who have the time to put it together and work on it. And so because I have infinite time on a project like this to record, because I'm just recording in my own bedroom studio, I know I can get as many cracks at each part as I want. And so I'm not too concerned about it. I'll do it as many times as I need to get each phrase right. Some of them I patch in 2 bars at a time or 1 bar at a time just to get that one awkward phrase. And even still, when you listen to it, you'll hear there's quite a bit of, I don't know, it doesn't always feel that great in the middle parts of the voicings. It doesn't swing that hard on some of the inner parts. But that being said, one of the things that Gil Evans was known to do was to write music that was intentionally hard so that there's some degree of struggle or tension and angst within the music. So I guess that's part of my philosophy too, is that I actually sometimes like the sound of a player having to work hard to produce and having to have that, you know, that grit within the music. So these are all, you know, little considerations. All right, I think we have to move on to the next thing. If you have any more questions about voicings, let me know. I'm also available via email, aaronhedenstrommusic@gmail.com, or Facebook Messenger or whatever. So feel free always to reach out that way. Okay, sweet. So orchestration, like I said, is pretty simple in this piece. It tends to be just that same lineup of flute, clarinet, soprano, alto, tenor, and then bass clarinet. And the reasoning behind this isn't exactly super complicated. It's just those are where the ranges of the instruments are. So I just kind of let that choose for me. You know, it would be weird if I put the tenor above the alto for the whole piece, or if the soprano was above the what am I saying? If the soprano was below the alto, it would be kind of weird. There are times when you can do that, and it's, you know, it's for the timbre and blend and to expose certain registers of each instrument. That's not always bad. But when I'm writing for solis and stuff like of this nature, I'm going to go with the default where the best range is just kind of where the hierarchy falls the best. And I like to think flute has a really nice sound as a lead too. So yeah, I think it's nice. And then I wanted to touch on the biggest change in orchestration throughout, which is at measure 171, there's this counterpoint line, and basically, let's see, I'll flip over to that. So if you look at the score, you'll see that that line is split up amongst the instruments. So bass clarinet plays, and then tenor takes up where it left off, and then alto dovetails. And that's what we call it, dovetailing, because you're basically creating a seamless transition from one instrument to the next to preserve the sense of the line. This was a technique that I learned from Ethan Wickman when I was studying composition at UW Eau Claire. He would always talk about dovetailing in orchestration as a way to kind of keep a line flowing smoothly from one instrument to the next. And it basically allows you to get a little bit more diversity of color within your line, because it's not just the same instrument playing it the whole time. It actually changes timbres mid line, and then also it allows you to have a wider range, because this low low E flat is not possible on tenor or alto. So I'm able to get that real low stuff, and also this higher up stuff, which would be super hard to play on bass clarinet. So I'm kind of putting everyone in a range that's comfortable, and then the parts themselves are really not that hard. But you get this kind of flowing line. And then the other benefit of this is with wind players, you always want to give a chance to breathe. That's actually one thing I did not do on this piece for the bass clarinet for most of it. And I found myself running out of breath when I was recording it. Again, thanks to the magic of overdubbing, it looks like I'm circular breathing. I'm really not. I do not have that skill. But if you listen in the recording to the very end, there's a couple spots where the bass line drops out a little bit because I'm breathing. So I try to retain some human elements of the performance like that in the recording, because I don't like it when something is so squeaky clean perfect that it doesn't even feel human anymore. I like to leave a couple of, little inaccuracies or little moments like that, because that's always what I've loved about jazz, is that it has these really imperfect moments. And you always know that it's being played by a real live human being with a soul. So, let's see. Yeah, so let's listen to this quick, and I'll just have you read along with the score. So here we go, coming off of the solo. Cool. All right, so that's it. Yeah, so Michael Clement has a great question here. My main question about dovetailing is how you keep instruments holding beyond the line. What's the logic behind when, how, and how long each of the instruments are holding? Okay, that's a really good question. I will try to give you a good answer. So, in a nutshell, I try to make the line intact, but make the instruments have an easy and melodic part to play. So, for example, ba-doo-dum, if I were to just have it go, if the bass clarinet just left it like that, that would actually also work. And I'm not saying that my way of doing it is the right way or the only way, but the intention behind it is that there's a little bit of like a fade out of the note, so that it's like cross fading between two edits. So this lends itself to a little bit more of a smoother feeling, where the notes are held instead of cutting off short. So like in the tenor, so then there's somewhat of a line there for them to play. And that way, it's not just ba-da-da, ba-da, ba-da, ba-da. It's not just these little fragments, but there's actually a line, and it makes it more playable ultimately. And then you have, what's also nice is that you have chord tones held over, and so that just adds a little bit of color. So then you have a little bit of the chord resonating. And Michael, since you're a piano player, you might think of it as holding down your sustain pedal a little bit to kind of keep some of the notes blending into the next ones, so that there's a little bit of that ambient effect. So that's my reasoning behind it. if that makes sense. Riley, hello Aaron, can you please share how your writing style is influenced when there is no rhythm section? Okay, thanks for the question, Riley. Definitely. So one of the problems with writing without a rhythm section is that every single thing has to be written out. There's no kind of rhythm section to hold down the fort when you leave a little space. That's one of the crutches that we can lean on as jazz arrangers. Is to me the basic need is to create variety. So I don't know, like here's another Rich DeRosa analogy, just to show you how influential he has been. He would always talk about the super sax quintet or something, where they would play all these sax solis, and it was just like 5 saxes, and they would just basically play, Parker solos harmonized or whatever. And he would be like, yeah, super sax sounds really good. You listen to one tune, hey, that sounds great. You listen to another tune, that's pretty good. You get to 5 tunes, and it's like he said it was like eating cheeseburgers. It's like 1 cheeseburger, yeah, it's nice. 2 cheeseburgers, all right. 3 or 4 or 5 cheeseburgers, it's a lot of the same. I'm starting to feel a little sick of it. So anytime I can get a cheeseburger in the mix, I instantly understand it a little bit better. Because I like cheeseburgers, and cheeseburgers are good. But they're not good enough that you could eat 10 of them, right? So my point being, you have to find ways to find some variety. So that could come with texture, like during these comping or these more like stagnant sections. I usually let those be a little more spacious so that there's a little contrast. And that's where I inserted the solos, because I felt like there was not enough going on its own. So like I let the improvised solo create something on top of that. So that there was some degree of spontaneity happening. It wasn't just do 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 do. After 16 bars of that, it gets a little old. So I use improvisation to spice things up. And then, like during the first time through the head, everything is basically homophonic, where everything's the same rhythm. Bum 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 ba da ba da da dum, except for the bass line breaks off sometimes. Bop 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 bop. My super musical scat bopping. My apologies for that. Scoopy doopy doopy da boop. No, just kidding. But yeah, so like that would be one texture, right? This homophonic texture where it's all rhythmically lined up, but the chords and the harmonies change. Back to the little solo interlude. It's slightly different the second time around. I don't just have the bump bump. I have a little so I took a pretty simple pattern, but I just mixed it up a little bit. And then when this harmonization comes in, the reharm I should say, then both the harmony and the rhythmic feel are changed up, and so that creates a little variety. So each time through the chorus, there's a little something different. Let's see. Yeah, the soli kind of just runs on its own. That's its own little 2-chorus texture. Words of the wise Zen sage. Cheeseburgers are good, but not as good as when you eat 10 of them. Yes, thank you, Jim. That is very true. Very true. Okay, so then for the solo then, at a certain point you get sick of the same texture. So one thing I learned writing sax quartet music was that stop time is a really good way to write when you don't have rhythm section, because it creates rhythmic excitement and also space, which is something you need, right, in music. So right here, 139, bop, 3 4, ba da da, 2 3 4, up. Soloist playing between those, so the soloist has some room to work there, not having to compete with all the harmony and stuff, because there's all this space. And so yeah, so that's one way I like to create, variety, is by using some stop time stuff. And then here, bump, 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 dun, 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 dun. Also, I think when you write with no rhythm section, you still have to just make everything feel good, so that like when you're listening to the piece, it still feels like there's like the swinging feel of a rhythm section. So I think just singing your lines out, before you write them down, helps you to find really good feeling rhythms. Bump, 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 da, 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 da. I try to avoid rhythmic phrases that feel like a mouthful, if that makes sense. If it feels awkward to sing, then, oh, hey, Kaviesh. Good to see you, man. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, if you feel like it's awkward to sing, it's probably something you could adjust to make it feel better. So, yeah, and then right here, the variety is it changes textures to this dovetail-y thing with two-part counterpoint, and yeah, and then also just variety of like harmonic approaches and things of that nature. I try not to sit still in the exact same place for too long, if that makes sense. It's always been something that I kind of feel like when you play a chart or listen to a chart that feels like it stays to sameness the whole time, it gets to be kind of a chore to listen to or to play. So, and of course you want to balance that, because I also try not to be like, oh, everything just feels so random, like, oh, it goes from one crazy thing to another unrelated crazy thing. And that's why it's such a hard thing to write a piece, right? So there are all these possible ways you could screw it up. All of which I have done many times. So, okay, so I hope that answers your questions, Riley. A lot of it has to do with the performers too. If you know that you're, having stuff played by good players with good time feels, you can get away with a lot of stuff. Kavi asked, what do you mean by dovetail? We had a discussion, Kavi, about the section where there's like, let's see if I can find it here on the share screen. There's this bass line that's split up into the different parts, and there's overlapping notes when it splits from bass clarinet to tenor to alto and back down. That's called dovetailing in composition, and so you're creating kind of a seamless line, but still splitting it up into the different instruments. So, yeah, thanks for the question. All right, so we've been going for about, an hour and a half or so. I would say this would be your last chance to ask some questions or comment on stuff, share your own wisdom on things, make a funny joke, anything that you can think of. For those of you who tuned in a little bit later, if you go to the top of the chat, you'll see a Google Drive link with the score and like a condensed score for harmony, and then a sheet with a bunch of analysis of this arrangement. So go ahead and download that if you'd feel so inclined. Again, if you have any last minute questions, feel free to jump in. And then a couple things just to mention. If you feel so inclined, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel so that it can, hopefully get a little bit of traction. And then also, if you want more arranger stuff. The Arrangers podcast is the other thing I do with Drew Zaremba. Great writer, and also overall quality musician and human being. But that's something you can check out as well. And then if you want to sign up for my mailing list, feel free to send me an email, and I can add you to that. Cool. Riley's got a question. What program did you make your video on? So I made it on Matt Sandler. What kind of gear did you use to record? Okay, good. So this is actually a workshop I'm going to be doing next Wednesday at the same time. I'm going to do one solely on the production of it. And so you can tune in next Wednesday at 8 or watch the replay of it afterwards if you can't make it. But I will answer your questions now anyways. So I used Adobe Premiere Pro for the video, as well as I used a program called Pixelmator, which I will just kind of share my screen here. It's a Photoshop clone for Mac that I really like. It's a little bit more user friendly than Photoshop. So like before I put it all into Premiere, I made these little squares in this software, and then I uploaded it into Premiere and did the editing there. For the video, I used a Zoom Q3 HD for recording video, and I actually here, let me show you. 1 second, I'm gonna run over and grab this thing quick. So a little while ago I went to Hobby Lobby and was just checking stuff out, and they had this fabric sale, outrageous discounts, and I got this green fabric for like $5, and I just hung it over a mic stand, and that was my green screen. So that's how I got the green screen effect, was just with a cheap piece of fabric. Worked pretty good. I had to do quite a bit of tweaking to it to make it look like I wanted it to. Yeah, I used the Zoom Q3 HD. I actually, if you see here, I have a lighting source, just a cheap lamp I got from Target, and a couple of YouTube videos about how lighting affects your videos. I have a piece of paper over it so it dims the lighting a little bit, but that kind of helped get the right lighting approach that I was looking for, roughly. And that's what I use to record the video. For the audio, I use, let's see if you can see this here. This is a Universal Audio preamp. It's called the Twinfinity, or the UA710. It's just a standalone preamp that has both a tube and a what do you call it? Solid state circuit. So it's got the option to add a little grit and dirt to it with a tube amp, or you can keep it clean. So I use that to record stuff at home. It's got a really nice sound to it. I used a Audio-Technica AT4033A for the microphone. It's a large diaphragm condenser with a very nice smooth sound to it, and it sounds pretty much good on all the woodwinds. And also I should note, because I record in a small room, you can see I have a reflection filter that just blocks out extra room reflections. So that was a really useful tool. And because I do a lot of home recording, that ends up being really useful. So I use that quite a bit. My wife and I also record a lot of songs together, and she sings really well. She's an amazing singer, and so she uses that for her voice too, and it does a really good job. So, and then I forgot. I record the preamp into a Focusrite Scarlett interface, which is pretty good for the digital audio conversion. And then I record that into Logic. Although I have a bunch of different ones like Pro Tools, Ableton, Harrison Mix Bus, but Logic is the one that I'm most familiar with, so I usually use that. But yeah, so keep put it on your schedule if you want to check more out about that. I'll be just kind of showing every step of the process for the production of it, what plugins I used, why, what EQ, compression, reverbs, mic placement, whatever you want to know about that, I can do that, and then how I mixed it, as well as the video production in Adobe Premiere. So hope that answers your question. All right, well, hey, thank you guys so much. This was super fun, and I didn't know what to expect. It's my first time doing a live stream class like this for just for fun, and I gotta say it was really cool. I really appreciated all of you for tuning in and for saying hello, for adding your questions and comments. So stay healthy and safe, make good choices, and miss seeing you guys all in person, but hopefully that day will come soon. And much love to you all. All right, take care.